Hello and welcome back to Portland Cocktail Week Distance Learning. I told you were going to be seeing a lot of me this week. What I didn't tell you was the good news is that you also get to see a lot of Erin this week. And we are back to talk more delicious spirits from Islay today. And today's class is Bruichladdich Distillery 101. I'm really excited about our Scotland-focused week. And Erin, like I said, is back with us for more education. Erin Schaeferle is the Collectif 1806 Northwest Brand Ambassador. And today, Erin's going to help us get acquainted with the terroir, people, and time behind Bruichladdich, Port Charlotte, and Octomore. I'm really excited about this because we are covering the unpeated, the peated, the heavily peated. We're doing it all today. We're going to explore the history of the Bruichladdich Distillery and its unconventional approach to making whiskey. And we're going to dive into each of the unique marks, and we're going to be laying the foundation for the Bruichladdich 201 class, classic Laddie Cask Components. So if you are going to Portland Cocktail Week, in person, IRL, live in real life, this class will be a prerequisite, that's how that word goes, for the 201 class that will happen in person at Portland Cocktail Week. So we are going to get into it. I was lucky enough to get to see Erin's slides before this, and then we've got a lot of ground to cover. But first, I want you to make sure that you like us here on Facebook. That is facebook.com/PDXCW, probably where you're watching us from. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. That is youtube.com/PDXCW. You can also watch all of our classes there. So you get to kind of pick your preference of viewing platform. Follow us on Instagram at PDXCW. You can always find out what is coming up next over on our Instagram page. Make sure you comment below. Ask your questions. Drop some love in the comments. Let us know we're doing a good job. We love that. We need that kind of validation. It is a Tuesday. And make sure you apply for Portland Cocktail Week. I spent months, maybe not months, it was at least a couple of weeks lying to everyone and telling them that Portland Cocktail Week applications closed on October 6th. And that's because I never know what day it is. But they are, in fact, still open for a few more days. And you can apply at pdxcw.com/apply, which means that you could be one of the people who get to take the 201 part of this class in person. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Erin because I feel like we have a lot to learn today.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Brittany. Hi to everyone watching either live or if you're tuning in later. As Brittany mentioned in her intro, my name's Erin Schaeferle. I am your Northwest Portfolio Ambassador for Collectif 1806. We are the bartender engagement arm of Remy Cointreau USA. We cover a wide variety of brands in our portfolio, but today we're going to talk about Bruichladdich. If you were on the live with me yesterday, or if you've watched it, we spoke about the Botanist, which is the Islay gin that we make at the Bruichladdich Distillery. Today, we're going to talk about the whiskeys a little bit. We do have a lot to cover, so to give you a little bit of an overview of what we're talking about today, first, I'm going to give you a really brief kind of introduction to the island of Islay. Then I'm going to talk about the history of the Bruichladdich Distillery, some of our kind of current things going on at the distillery as a company and as what we do there. And then from there, we're going to move into talking about our core product range, the actual whiskeys themselves. So a couple different pieces. We're going to stop along the way. Brittany will ask your questions if you type them into the chat or into comments. So let's get started. So here on our first page is a photo of the Bruichladdich Distillery, which is located on Islay. Islay is a part of a chain of Scottish islands called the Inner Hebrides. It's the first landfall from the Atlantic Ocean before the Scottish mainland, and it gets a lot of fierce Atlantic storms, rain, salt air, etc. And if you were to leave Islay's west coast, the next stop is Newfoundland, Canada. So it's out there. It's pretty remote. And that position is crucial to the spirits that we make, as well as our people and our heritage. It's a pretty small island in terms of both size and population. So there's about 3,500 people on the island and about 35,000 sheep. We like to joke that kind of the only things there are to do there is make whiskey and count sheep. So to that end, there are 9 single malt whiskey distilleries on the island of Islay. There's 2 more in the planning and building stages. There's the big names that you might be familiar with, Ardbeg, Lefroy, Lagavulin. Those are kind of down in the southern part. Caligula and Bunnahabhain that are up in kind of the north, I guess that would be eastern portion of the island. And then there are Kilchoman and Bruichladdich that are over kind of right in the middle, like southwestern portion of the island, and Bowmore that's right across the water, across the port. So there's also a few others that I'm not going to get into, but 9 that are currently there, 2 more. And we're going to talk about Bruichladdich. So starting in 1881, Bruichladdich Distillery was founded in 1881 by 3 brothers, Robert, Will, and John Harvey. They came to Islay from Glasgow, where they already operated 2 distilleries, and their plan was to open a distillery on Islay. At this time, there was something like 27 distilleries on the island, although they were more like farms with stills on them. Making whiskey was just kind of a way of life for people there. It was something that they did with the grain that they were growing, right? So one brother in this trio was a distiller, one was an engineer, and one was a financier. The idea being that there was one person who knew how to build it, one person who knew how to handle the money, and a third who knew how to make whiskey. Bruichladdich was at the time the most technologically advanced distillery on Islay. It was the first legal or purpose-built distillery for whiskey production. And it had a very specific location that was chosen based on its access to water. So there was a port, it's still there, like right across the road from the Bruichladdich Distillery that was used for shipping in and out. There's also a burn, as they would call it, or a river that flows right underneath and through the distillery. And it's positioned on a hill that allowed gravity to sort of help with the work of production. So the actual still house itself is kind of built on a slope. And from the mash tun to the wash tuns into the still house, it kind of all travels downhill and helps with that. If you think in 1981, nothing was like mechanical really. So we did have very high-tech equipment in the Victorian era, but they built it this way on purpose, right? So these 3 brothers' initial plan was to produce grain spirit at these 2 distilleries on the mainland and malt whiskey on Islay so that the blends they produced would dominate the whiskey market for years to come. It's important to note that at this time and up until about the 1980s, pretty much all whiskey, all single malt was used for blends. This concept of single malt whiskeys, things that are from one distillery, was pretty foreign to the market until about the 1980s. That's a different conversation, something that we'll talk about more at Portland Cocktail Week at the 201. So their intention was to sort of dominate the whiskey market with their blends, but there was some family fallout and some money mismanagement. The ownership was very stop-start with some financial problems. And the Harvey reign ended in 1929 when the distillery was closed. Bruichladdich was taken over in 1935, but the uncertainty continued all through the 20th century. A lot of changes in ownership at the distillery due to, financial problems, environmental problems, prohibition, et cetera, all of these issues. And there was subsequent neglect to the production areas of the distillery. Eventually, it came under ownership of White Mackay, who, after running it as a production distillery for quite some time, abruptly shut it down in 1994. So, White Mackay also owned Jura Distillery that was very nearby, right across the way, and decided that they didn't need to spend money operating these 2 blended whiskey facilities so close together, right? They had this other one. They didn't need to operate Bruichladdich as well. So they effectively mothballed the location. The closure had a really negative impact for the whole surrounding area, as everyone who was employed at the distillery lived right around there. It was a really unfortunate time for Islay, and I've chatted with some of the folks on our team who were born and raised there who remember this time. And there was essentially no notice for this team that you see in this photo. The guys finished their day's work on a Friday. They had their dram. They got handed a paycheck and they got told not to come back on Monday. So really devastating for that team. Only 2 people kept their jobs. So in this photo, the 2 men who kept their jobs are Budgie and John Rennie, both in the back left of the photo. And the distillery was not producing any spirit, but their roles were to fulfill contracts with the blenders, as we still had thousands of casks remaining in the warehouses, and they were also there to oversee the property. So fast forward to 2001. There were 5 people in 2001 that became essential to Bruichladdich return to glory, both in the purchase of the distillery and in its return to production. And those 5 people were Mark Rainier and Simon Coughlin, 2 wine merchants from London, Jim McEwen, who was then the head distiller at Bowmore and a born and bred Islay man, engineer Duncan McGillivray, who had started work at Bruichladdich Distillery in 1974 and was appointed distillery manager upon the reopen, and then senior stillman Dunky Budgie McFadden, who you saw in the photo before. The story of Bruichladdich resurgence actually starts with Mark Grenier winning a bottle of wine at a trade show. He was a wine merchant. He was at a trade show, threw a business card into a little bowl, and he ended up winning this bottle, right? So he goes to pick it up from this gentleman, Alec Larry. And while he's there, Alec's like, try some of these different single malts in his collection. Now, think at this time in the 1990s, this was when independent bottlers were starting to buy these single barrels or these barrels from these distilleries and bottle them and sell them as single malts. They weren't blended. But this was all happening through independent bottling companies. This wasn't happening from the distilleries themselves. So Mark's there. He gets offered this independent bottling of a Bruichladdich spirit, and he's just blown away by the spirit. He sees that it has this very floral and elegant flavor to it. It shows all of the kind of flavor profiles and nuances that he would expect in a fine wine. And he gets really like enamored with Bruichladdich. So he ropes Simon Coughlin into this. They had come from the wine industry, and they were really amazed by the quality and complexity of the Bruichladdich spirit that was coming from those very, high tech in the Victorian era stills that we had, which we'll talk about later. So these two vowed they were going to create a real Islay single malt using the values of terroir, like the wine that they knew so well, and the traditional Victorian equipment that has always been there, combined with all of our traditional methods to create a very authentic single malt whiskey. So Mark had this little obsession. He wrote his first letter to request to buy Bruichladdich from its current owners in 1996. They said no. And as the story goes, he wrote a letter every year at Christmas time until they finally said yes in 2001. So we get to 2001, and they purchased the distillery by an independent consortium of 50 shareholders led by Mark and Simon for about £7 million, which included all of the machinery and the stock in the warehouses. So Mark and Simon, having spent their years in the wine industry, had a really good understanding of terroir and provenance, right? But when it came to Scotch, they were really surprised to find that a national drink so steeped in history and tradition had really no interest in the origin of its ingredients. At that time, the distillery spoke a lot about their origins and how it related to the whiskey in terms of history. But Mark and Simon found that there was not a lot of connection between the land and the liquid in the whiskey industry, despite it being such a huge part of the marketing. Supply and demand had really taken over. Efficiency was the order of the day. And the barley that gave the most liters of alcohol per ton was always favored, regardless of where it came from. And Mark really wanted to bring back the concept of terroir to whiskey, to bring a sense of place and traceability back to the industry from which it had been replaced with profit and efficiency. So from the day that the distillery gates reopened in 2001, their vision was clear. They were going to use this traditional Victorian equipment. They were going to use local ingredients and on-site maturation and bottling to create the most thought-provoking spirit possible. So here's a little timeline. Since 2001, we've made it our mission to reconnect land and liquid, to ensure that our products really do speak to where they come from, and to put emphasis on Islay and our community. We source barley from Islay, we make whiskey from Islay, and we have Islay people involved in every stage of the process. To that end, and we can go to the next slide here, Bruichladdich is one of the only distilleries in the world to be B Corp certified. In a continuation of our efforts toward community focus and environmental stewardship, as well as our true Islay identity, we were awarded B Corp status in 2021. Although our accreditation has only been recently awarded, it's an affirmation for us that we are on the right path. It shows that all of the hard work we've done from the very beginning to reduce our environmental impact, support our local community, and invest back in our island has been recognized, and there's still a lot more to come. There are less than 3,500 companies worldwide with B Corp accreditation. I think that might have increased a little bit in the last few months. Bruichladdich is one of very few distilleries, with, I think at this time, still Sipsmith being the only other gin company at the moment to hold that certification. I know Maker's Mark just received theirs as well. But it's very difficult for a distillery to receive B Corp certification. Making distilled spirits is naturally kind of an environmentally challenging and not super sustainable business. So that certification is really not the end for us, but it's just the beginning, and it really shows our commitment. The B stands for benefit. If you're not familiar with B Corp, it's about balancing your people and your profit, using your business as a force for good. It's a fantastic recognition for all the work we've done since 2001 and to ensure that we're supporting our staff, growing the business responsibly and being sustainable across all of those areas, right? So this tells you what a B Corp is. It's a community of leaders driving a global movement of people using business as a force for good. It's definitely, and you can go next slide, more than a certificate. It's a philosophy of doing business. So simply put, you can see here, using business as a force for good. This might seem drastic, but B Corp is a growing force of businesses. We're pushing boundaries on the way that we think and make decisions. Whiskey and gin just so happen to be the vehicle for Bruichladdich, but we're using them in a way that means we can positively impact people's lives and leave a legacy of a world better off for having us a part of it. We're putting people and the planet in line with our profit. So we're acting socially and environmentally responsible. It's no longer only about growth of sales. It's about growing sustainably in a way that takes into account the impact of our business decision that has on our environment and our people. We're looking at the whole ecosystem of which we belong. And then finally, this is an external accreditation that's globally recognized. And B Corp carries true accountability. It's reviewed every 3 years. So we're really proud of our B Corp status. It's something we love to talk about. Now, this is where we're going to maybe get into the whiskeys. Before we do that, I just want to see if Brittany wants to pop back in, if there happens to be any questions or anything about the history or about B Corp.
We don't have any questions, just a lot of people saying hi.
Hello.
But I do think it's really interesting seeing many of our favorite distilleries in Islay have gone through this period where the distillery was mothballed and then like it was revived and now it's this huge part of the community in Islay. And I think it's really interesting to see how these brands have navigated that and people who were really passionate about those brands and passionate about making Scotch and specifically in Islay, went after it, right? They were like, okay, no one's using this, give it to me. I want to do something with it. And being able to see, brands that people knew and loved and then kind of died, and then people come in and inject that new life and bring those jobs back to the community, because Islay's not very big, so a lot of people there work in the Scotch industry in some form or fashion. So I just think it's really cool in hosting our Scotch Whiskey Diploma program, kind of hearing about some of the other distilleries who have been through this very similar situation and seeing that it's something that Bruichladdich has had to face as well, but that has also come back to be such a fantastic product and one that is something that bartenders really want to work with and walk behind their bars and want on their shelves. It's something that people come in and they're like, oh man, like you have Octomore? That's so cool. Like, let me get one of those. So I just wanted to point out that I think that's a really interesting part of many brands' histories on Islay. And I really appreciate you bringing it up.
Yeah, definitely. And I was just there visiting. I was very lucky to get to go over to Islay not more than maybe 3 weeks ago. I just got back. And the folks who are there, a lot of the people who work for us are Islay born and bred. They've been there their whole life. And as I mentioned, like the people who were there who are, 1994 was not that long ago. I was born in 1993. So you're looking at like about how long ago that was. People remember that, they were there, they were living it. They remember like the devastation that it had on their local community to see this place shut down, and how ingrained in the culture it was for those jobs to be there, and for people to be able to make whiskey. And it speaks a lot to just the culture on Islay and also Bruichladdic's commitment. One thing I didn't note is that all of the men who lost their jobs in 1994 were rehired in 2001. So those were the first people to get their jobs back. Which I think is really awesome. Most of them are still there today. And it's, it really is like so deeply ingrained in the community there and so important. So I love that history. I loved hearing about it, from the horse's mouth, as it were, going to talk to those folks on Islay. And they are like, as a community, just the best people. They're like so amazing. It's like life-changing. If anyone ever has an opportunity to go, please do. Whether with the Bruichladdich team or with any of the other distilleries, like go meet those folks because it'll change your life.
Did you hear everyone. Erin's off to take us all to Islay. So I'll get with her about our travel details and forward them. But I do
Definitely.
also love that you mentioned, I didn't know that when the distillery was reopened that they rehired the team that had to be let go when it was originally shuttered. And I think that's such a cool like fact that really showcases the commitment to people and place that helps, make Bruichladdich a B Corp, like really living that philosophy. We do have one question now.
Yes,
how many people from Islay work at Bruichladdich now?
that is a great question. And you're going to get that answer a little later in the presentation when we talk about the people a little more. But at this time, there's 114 people at the distillery. And not all of them are from Islay. Some have come from the mainland, but the vast majority of the people at the distillery are from Islay. I would say like maybe 75%. And it is a fun thing to note. You're going to hear it again later in the presentation, but since it got asked, we are the largest private employer on Islay, even though we are the third smallest distillery in terms of production. So to talk about the way that we make our whiskey and our commitment to people, we are the largest private employer. We're the second largest employer behind the government. So the only other part of Islay that employs more people on the island is the government, the Scottish government.
So
that's
Erin's
like kind of running things on the island.
Erin's taking us to Islay, and we all have jobs when we get there. So congratulations, everyone watching today. Erin is changing all of our lives.
Yeah.
We have another question, and then we'll move on because I know we got to get into these products, and I'm really excited. And I think you might be going into this, so if you are, forgive me, but I'm trying to look at you, and our presenter notes are on my other tab, and I don't want to be like reading over here. What is the production volume for Bruichladdich?
We are going to go down into production volume. Hi, Cam. So I'll hit it when we get down to our barrels and everything. We've got about 22 warehouses. They're filling about 200 barrels a week. Let's see if I want to give you that number. We have about 100,000 casks in our storage right now as of 2022. That gives you some of the like quick numbers, but as we go through the production process, we're going to talk about like how many liters in the still and all of those pieces. So I'm going to leave it.
I remember I was like, I've seen this, and I know it's later, but let me double check because I didn't want to miss anything. Well, excellent. I know now we get to talk about all of the delicious products. So I don't want to hold up the process, but if you have more questions, you can put them in the comments. We will get to them at the next appropriate question break, or at the end, if it's a question that maybe is a little more involved, might take a little bit more time to go into. So don't stop asking, but we're going to talk about whiskey.
Yes, we are. All right. So now that you kind of have the location and the history, we're going to talk about the malts brands. As I mentioned, there's actually 4 brands, distinct brands that are made at the Bruichladdich Distillery. There's 3 here on the screen. The 4th one being the Botanist Gin. You can actually, that side, you can see the bottle right behind me here. We did a class on the Botanist yesterday, so we're not going to touch on it too much, but important to know that it is made at the Bruichladdich Distillery. For today, we're talking about our 3 brands that have significantly different flavor profiles and different appeal. The majority of the volume that we make goes through our Bruichladdich malts brand and is driven by our core product, the Classic Laddie. That's that blue bottle that you see on the screen. Also behind me, over on that side, I'm mirrored on my on my screen, so I'm getting tripped up when I point at things. I should stop doing that. That is our core product, the Classic Laddie in that blue bottle. Then we have Port Charlotte, which is our heavily born to compete and disrupt the Islay peated flavor profile category. It's also the first whiskey that we made upon reopening in 2001. We'll touch on that in a little bit. And then we have Octomore. That's our super heavily peated. It's actually the most heavily peated whiskey in the world. It's an experience in and of itself and has a really strong niche cult following. If you're a big peat head and a big whiskey person, you probably know about Octomore. That's a limited release. It actually just came out this past week in all major markets. So if you are an Octomore person, now is your time to snatch it up before it's all gone. These products are all really different, but they all have the same values, right? So our values remain the same no matter what malt we're talking about, and even the gin. And those are right here on the screen. Being transparent about our products with our customers, giving them all of the information that we can, that we're legally allowed to so that they can make an informed choice on what they buy. Creating whiskeys with provenance, and gin, honestly, with provenance. We're one of the only distilleries in Scotland to openly declare that we use 100% Scottish barley. Raw ingredients matter. If it's a Scotch whiskey, then it should be made using Scottish barley and exploring different varieties of barley. Quality, using only the best quality barley and casks, not to mask the character of our spirit, but to build it. Putting an emphasis on flavor, using the quality of our ingredients and our focus on transparency to help the consumers understand and appreciate the flavor and where it's coming from. A connection to place, making sure that if it is not only Islay on the bottle, but in the bottle too. So that means our maturation, our bottling, the water that we use, all of those things are Islay, born and bred. And that brings us to being Islay-centric. We want our products and our success to benefit the community, not only the business, building local pathways and funding other projects. So as I mentioned, all of these things are in common. We're going to talk about, what makes our whiskey. So Bruichladdich Distillery produces these 3 distinct brands of single malt, all with their own unique characteristics and variables in production. But even with these variables, there are parts of the process that remain consistent for all of the malts. So right now we're going to discuss those consistent elements. I'll make some notes along the way about maybe where things diverge a little bit among each of those brands. And then we're going to talk about each product in the core range that I just mentioned. So to start, we're going to talk about water. We use 3 different water sources in our production process at Bruichladdich, 2 of which do affect the flavor. One is our source water at Antoran Reservoir, and the other is our bottling water from Octomore Spring, which is used to bring our whiskeys and our gin down to bottling strength. If you were on the botanist presentation yesterday, we talked a little bit about Octomore Farm and where that water comes from. It's an underground spring that runs right on the edge of Octomore Farm. It's housed in this little shed just to protect it. And this water is incredibly pure. It's filtered through 1.8 billion year old gneiss rock. So it's very highly mineralized. And that is what we use to bring our whiskeys down to bottling strength, as well as the gin. You can see in that photo right there, that is actually a little well bucket that goes down into the Octomore Spring well being poured into a glass. That water is crystal clear and drinkable right out of the spring. I filled my water bottle with it when we were there. It's delicious. The third water source is the Bruichladdich River, or the burn that we use to cool the condensers. If you remember when I was talking about the history, I mentioned that the distillery was purpose-built in this very specific location with the river running through it. That is what I'm talking about. So that's used for cooling. It doesn't go into the product, but it's important to our production. So to be called Islay single malt, we really believe it should be as authentically Islay as possible. Imagine 50% of your bottle is alcohol, right? If it's bottled at 50% ABV. And the rest is water. We want it to be the purest water possible. So that means instead of leaving the island in tankers, as most of the other distilleries do, or actually all of them do, all of the bottles and corks and labels, et cetera, come onto the island at extra effort, cost and risk of adverse weather for us to be bottled with that Islay spring water and then shipped out again in cases. That piece, I have to tell you, I took the trip to get to Islay on the ferry, which is the way that all of the spirits come on and off the island. It is not an easy task. It's a long drive to get back into, a less remote part of the mainland. The ferry ride is long. It's a really significant, arduous thing to make sure that we can bottle everything on the island and bring it back off that way. Okay, so we've talked about the water. Now we're going to talk about the barley. And terroir, the impact that an environment has on produce from that location in whiskey is a relatively new concept to most people, but it's a concept that we've championed since Bruichladdich was reopened. We passionately believe in terroir, in authenticity, place, and provenance, and ultimately traceability. Whiskey is an artisan product, and it should speak to where it's from. We are one of only 2 of Islay's 9 distilleries which are using any locally grown barley at all. Kilchoman is the other. And the main reason being that growing on Islay is much more difficult than on mainland Scotland, or indeed most of the places in Europe. This is mainly due to the climate, the geese, the deer, the sheep, the sheer lack of harvesting equipment available to our 17 partner farmers. It's not easy, but easy isn't really what we want. It's about supporting local agriculture and providing that extra income to the local farmers and reconnecting to the land on which we live, and reconnecting that land to the whiskey that comes from here. So whether on Islay or elsewhere in Scotland, we know all of our farmers by name and face. They're our partners rather than suppliers, and we share with them all of the benefits of the year in the field as their harvest, our raw ingredient grow to maturity. And unlike many Scotch whiskeys, our barley is 100% Scottish grown. Since Bruichladdich opened in 2001, almost all of the barley has been malted by Baird's Maltings. That's a malting company based in Inverness on the mainland. This malting is done. This malting alone has organic certification, a plentiful storage space for our different farming partners, and can produce peated barley for Port Charlotte and Octomore, according to our specifications and in smaller field units. This is kind of a fun fact. This is a piece of history that I also didn't know until fairly recently. Port Charlotte, our heavily peated single malt, was the first spirit that we produced after reopening in 2001. And at that time, we went with Diageo Maltings in Port Ellen, which is in the south of Islay, for them to supply us. And they did a batch of 40 parts per million malt that would go on to become the first spirit run from the stills again in 2001. We worked with them for that first year after reopening. And then it kind of became obvious that business is business. They started telling us exactly what parts per million they would peat our malt to, and how much they would provide. And they wanted upfront payments. Something that a company that was just reopening out of a mothballed state really couldn't do. So we found an alternative in 2002. We started working with Baird's in Inverness. And since then, we've built a really strong relationship with them. They're willing to malt and dry our barley to our exact specifications. Each of our core whiskeys start with Scottish grown barley, either from the mainland or from Islay itself, which goes through a process of 2 days of steeping, 5 days of germination on the malting floor, and finally kilning or drying to create the malt, which is in turn ultimately turned into Classic Laddie, Port Charlotte, or Octomore. As I noted, this is going to be one of those little spots where the brands diverge, right? So Bruichladdich, Classic Laddie is unpeated. It's dried using hot air. Port Charlotte is peated to a consistent 40 parts per million. How does that happen? It's actually a blend of the Octomore and the Classic Laddie malt that's combined to hit that exact peating. Octomore undergoes a 5-day peating process using 9 tons of peat. And it comes out anywhere from 80 to 300 parts per million. Pretty wild. Most of the stuff that comes out in the bottle for Octomore ends up being like around 140, 150 ppm, but it kind of varies year to year, which we'll talk about later. So that is the malt. Now we're going to talk about milling. This is actually a photo from the visit that I was just on. You can see me down in the white sweater looking very attentive to Rab, one of the folks teaching us that week. He's amazing. But this was kind of the best photo I had to show you our Victorian era mill. So the process at the distillery itself begins in the mill and involves crushing that malted barley into something called grist. It's essentially like a flour. That process is essential because it gives access to the starch right inside of those malted barley pieces. Our leather belt-driven bobby mill dates back to 1913. It uses a series of belt and scoop elevators to raise and drop the malt. The barley's taken through the 1881 dressers upstairs, which acts as like a sieve to sort of remove all the dust and stones and residue from the malt before going into a weighing basket, which feeds 40 kilos of barley through the mill at 60 to 90 second intervals until 7 tons is needed and is milled down for production. So there's a start when we're talking about production quantity. Each production, we're using 7 tons of Scottish barley. That's taken over to the mash house and stored in the grist hopper before mashing. I want to show you, if you make the photo a little bit bigger, if we can go back one before we go into mashing, that little chalkboard in the back there, to tell you guys that we don't use computers. Everything is done by hand at Bruichladdich. I am not kidding. That little chalkboard back there is how they're tracking what got milled that day. There is no computer generation. It's not automated. You know, the folks who work in the mill house are turning this stuff on and off by hand, and they're tracking it by hand. And that is going to continue as a theme through all of the parts of this production process. It's actually It's like one of those things that you think maybe is being exaggerated or is just a story. But if you go there and see it, there are no computers. Everything is being done by hand. It's really amazing. Okay, so we can go on to mashing. This photo I also took on the trip while we were there. This is the rake arm that's inside our open top cast iron mash tun, which is from 1881. Only 6 of these remain in Scotland, and only one of them is on Islay. If you were to build a new distillery today, you do need to use a closed top steel mash tun. They don't let you use the open tops anymore. I believe it's like a health and safety issue. Very easy to drop things in there and have some bad stuff happen. But we got sort of grandfathered in on that. So Bruichladdich and Bunnahabhain distilleries were both built in 1881, and we had actually both ordered the exact same specification of mash tun at that time. The one that we have was actually delivered to Bunnahabhain first, but they weren't ready for it. So it was taken by Puffer around the coast of Islay and fitted at the Bruichladdich distillery. And then Bunnahabhain took the second one when it arrived. So we get to say we had the first one. I think that's kind of cool. It's really incredible to tell people that every single bottle of Bruichladdich that's ever been created all comes down to this one piece of equipment that's still used today. Every single mash build, everything that we've ever done has gone through this open top mash tun. It's hard to see. I don't think you can see it in this photo really. But actually there was an issue where the rake arm in there was broken at one point, and there was nobody on earth that knew how to rebuild that piece of Victorian era equipment. And it's my understanding that they had to pay like an engineering firm to like build the instructions to then give to a metalworking company so that they could build the pieces to replace it. And it's really fascinating. If you look at the replaced pieces on that arm, they are degrading at a faster rate than the pieces from 1881. So that just gives you a little bit of like an understanding of the quality of Victorian era tech and how they were building things back then. Some things just can't be replicated, you know? So when we're talking about the mashing process, there's, you know, multiple stages of adding water into the mash to sort of extract that sugar, right? Most of the modern closed top mash tuns use a 3-water method, right? So they're adding 3 rounds of water at varying temperatures and for varying durations. We do a 4-water method. That's because we have that open top where we lose a lot more heat and steam. So at this stage, our aim is to convert the starch and the grist into sugar. So we're steeping in hot water, and we maximize the amount of sugar extracted by adding water at varying intervals. So we add the water 4 times. I'm not going to dig too far into the specific quantities of water, the temperatures, or how long it steeps, because we will be here. It's already 38 minutes in, and I have a lot more to talk about. Please DM me on Instagram. They'll pop my Instagram up here on the screen. I will absolutely chat with you about these details if you'd like, but I don't want to be on here for 3 hours. I don't think you guys will stick with me that long. So we've created, you know, all of this nice sugary water. We're going to talk about fermentation. So we've explored a lot of variables in the whiskey making process at Bruichladdich, but we've kept our yeast consistent throughout our experimentation. We use a mixture of 2 types, a fast-acting MX strain and a slow-acting M strain that gives us the right balance of quality and yield. So the strains ensure that we maintain that Laddie DNA in our fermentation stage. We take a minimal intervention approach. We continue to use Oregon pine washbacks, despite industry convention that now favors stainless steel. And essentially what we're trying to do is get the flavor of the malted barley in the wash to carry through into the distillation process. There are flavors from the spent yeast as well. And since we aren't chill filtering, these flavors are also important. The barley is the main raw ingredient and the one that we're most interested and committed to. So if people are buying an Islay barley whiskey from us, which is one of our sort of barley exploration lines, we want them to be able to taste that difference that the barley makes or that the farms make. So the yeast strains have become very constant. This is Bruichladdich though. We love to mess with things, so don't rule anything out. Maybe we'll do a yeast experiment in the future. I can't tell you for sure. So now we're going to talk about distilling. Bruichladdich from its inception has always been a bit of an outlier. We're not really interested in scientific meddling or computerization or economic efficiency or running things like Starship Enterprise, where it's like one guy in a computer in an office. That's just like everything's running itself. We use a slow manual distillation. Like I said, no computers used in the production process. We use these tall, slim neck spirit pot stills that give our classic Laddie that light, floral, and elegant style. And these copper stills have produced a great single malt for us for going on 130 years. So this is the part of the process that can get a little confusing in terms of verbiage. So stick with me here in terms of the most technical part of the presentation. And this is going to answer some questions as well about quantities. So we have 2 wash stills. They're filled around 12,000 liters, and they run between 94 and 110 degrees Celsius. The liquid from these stills, these wash stills, are known about as low wines, and it's about 24% ABV. That wash distillation takes about 6.5 hours. So those low wines feed into the faints receiver, where it rests with the waste product of the previous spirit distillation. That's the faints and the foreshots. Remember this part because it gets a little confusing. So that sort of tank, that low wines and the faints and foreshots from the previous distillation are now all mixed together, and they get taken over to our spirit stills for the second distillation. Each still is filled with between 7,000 and 8,000 liters of that low wines. The spirit stills at Bruichladdich are super tall and narrow. The slender style was designed by one of the 3 brothers who were 27 years old at the time, and their aim was to produce a really floral and elegant spirit by making it more difficult for the vapors to reach the top of the still. You have to remember at this time, this distillery was designed to make blends. So they were taking this single malt and they were blending it with their grain distillates from the mainland. So what they wanted out of this particular distillery was a very floral, light, elegant spirit. Combining those very, very tall, slim necks with what's known as a slow or trickle distillation, we coax that spirit up really gently, ensuring that we're getting all the esters and fatty acids and proteins that are carried up with the spirit, so we get that really full-bodied, floral, and viscous spirit. So in terms of timing, because we like to talk about this part, everyone's always interested. If you like whiskey, the distillation process, I'll give you some specifics. So foreshots begin to come out of our spirit stills at around 78 degrees Celsius. The stills reach about 90 degrees Celsius by cutoff time. The approximate running time for the spirit stills is a total of 7 hours, and it gets broken down as follows. First 35 to 40 minutes of the spirit to come through the safe is known as the foreshots. That's the methanol of the distillation. If you ever hear about like moonshiners going blind from drinking their spirit, that's because they cut it too late or too soon, and they didn't. What I'm trying to say is they left the methanol in and they went blind because it's poisonous. Don't drink that. But what we do with those foreshots, they run down through 2 outer jugs and into that low wines and faints receiver that I mentioned earlier, right? So that beginning part goes back in to get redistilled with the low wines from our next distillation. The next 2.5 hours of the distillation is known as the middle cut. That is the new make spirit that gets filled into our casks. That's running about 68 to 70%. So on average, the casks are filled at 69%. Often for like blended spirit or for commercial spirit, they'll cut down to water and put into cask at about 63.5%, but we go a little higher proof. The final 3 hours of the run are known as the faints. And at that point, the alcohol percentage begins to drop. There's a lot of water being taken up into the still. And that part actually goes back right into the faints receiver and is combined with the next batch of low wines. So I know that's like maybe a little bit confusing, but I have a little image that I can show you if you guys want to pop to the next slide. There's actually a infographic, and we're probably going to have to make it big. There we go. So you can kind of take a look at how this all works with a visual. Sometimes that's a little easier. So for each ton of barley that we use, we get around 400 liters of new make. So each production run will give you around 2,800 liters of middle cut, depending on the specific barley that we're using at that time. So again, that's going to answer a little bit of the question about production size for each run. So for us, it's about quality, not quantity. We're not really focused on the volume. That's not the point. The point is on getting the most flavor out of the product. So that's our distillation process. And then the last piece in terms of the technical stuff is maturation. So we're going to move on. And I'm moving quickly because I want to make sure that we have time to talk about some of the products themselves and ask questions and things like that. So to legally be called whiskey, that new make spirit has to be matured for a minimum of 3 years and a day in oak casks. You wouldn't believe it when I tell you that in order to be called an Islay single malt, you don't have to mature your whiskey on Islay. It simply needs to be distilled there. This is a major part of where Bruichladdich sets itself apart. All of our casks are matured on Islay, either at the distillery or in one of the Lockendall warehouses in Port Charlotte. As of now, as I mentioned earlier, we have 22 warehouses on the island and a stock of around 100,000 casks as of 2022 and continue to fill approximately 200 barrels a week. Among these casks, we actually have 230 different types of barrel, providing a really wide array of flavor possibilities. And we're going to talk about why that's important actually at the 201 class. So to ensure that we use only the best quality casks, we have a grading system to monitor how many times the barrel's been used. Once a fresh barrel is used, the ends are painted white and it's now considered a second fill. And after another use, the barrel ends are then painted aqua, the Bruichladdich aqua, like you can see behind me. And it's considered a third fill. So while these second and third fill barrels may be considered inferior in terms of quality and what they can give, there's a good reason for using them. For example, after creating a marriage of several casks for Classic Laddie, our lead distiller, Adam Hannett, might feel that the spirit would benefit from a little longer maturation, but not want the oak to influence and alter the spirit inside. So in that case, it goes into a third fill cask. The specific cask types, length of maturation, and blending process changes among each brand we create, but the ethos remains the same. High quality casks, matured under the watchful eye of our expert team on the island of Islay for the entire duration of their aging process. And that brings us into the environment. So no two casks of spirit are the same or mature at the same rate or in the same way. So it's essential that they're here with us on Islay where we can watch over them. We mature 100% of the spirit on Islay. Our warehouses sit above or on the shores of Lockendall, the sea lock, which defines that sort of westerly rim of Islay. And it takes in a lot of that Atlantic salty air. The warehouse has 13 employees and the casks are watched over by these folks on the shores for their whole lives. They're completely exposed to the full force of those Atlantic storms I mentioned right at the beginning, particularly the prevailing wind of the Southwest. And that salt in the air and the earth and the influence on cask, those vaporized salt molecules are smaller than the oak grain, believe it or not. And that salty marine rich air oxygenates the spirits as the casks breathe in and out like all day, like a lung, right? So it doesn't mean we're making salty whiskey, but we like to say that the salt accentuates the flavor. It's like seasoning your food, right? Some people might think that I'm making that part up too. I don't know. I will tell you, we went out, this is a botanist tangent, but we went out foraging for some of the botanicals that were in the botanist. And while we were out foraging, there were all of these blackberry brambles sort of growing wildly everywhere. And I did pick a couple blackberries and eat them while we were walking. And the blackberries themselves had like a salty tinge to it because the air is so salinated right in those coastal areas. So I thought that was really interesting. I tasted it for myself. That impact is definitely there on all of the produce and all of the things that are grown on Islay. So finally, what is our one last consistent piece? And this goes back to the question earlier about how many people are working at Bruichladdich. The last piece that's consistent among all of our whiskeys is our people. So I mentioned we have 114 people working full-time on the island. We're the largest private employer, even though we're its third smallest producer. And since our renaissance in 2001, Islay has been at the very heart of all of our business's decision-making. So we have a really strong sense of responsibility to Islay and the people who live there. We just talked about that earlier. It really is meaningful. And to us, it means spreading economic benefit of the whiskey industry into the community, whether that's directly through employment or indirectly through opportunities in farming or haulage, or even hospitality, all of like the pubs and bars that carry the product, right? Or construction. So that's what to us really makes a true Islay whiskey. So before we go into the core range, Brittany, anything that I need to chat on?
We do have a question, but I think you might cover it when you're talking about the core range. So I don't want to jump the gun here. So let's do that part and then we can come back to this if it wasn't answered.
Cool. All right. That's the most information heavy piece. Talking about the individual whiskeys is a little shorter. So I want to give everyone a break. Reset your brain. We're gonna, here we go. All right. So we've had a look at the common threads that run through all of our whiskeys. I'm going to circle back to the image I showed you earlier of the 3 core brands. You saw this earlier in the presentation. You can go to the next slide. I am bringing it back here so that we can have a fresh look, right? So we have the Classic Laddie, the Port Charlotte, and the Octomore. So let's start with the Classic Laddie. This is an unpeated Islay single malt whiskey, which is unusual in and of itself. It combines the use of 100% Scottish barley. It's higher ABV compared to some of the different whiskeys that you'll see out there. It's 50% ABV. And the quality of its components make it a really incredible single malt. This one is really great if you're new to Scotch, if you're a little intimidated by the super heavily peated stuff. Give Bruichladdich a try. It'll really introduce you to, again, sort of the influence of the barley and the grain without giving you the peat. So if you're a little afraid of the peat smoke, start here. Classic Laddie is actually non-age statement or multi-vintage. That relies on the skill of the blender to choose the best casks from a lot of different vintages and to create a definitive flavor profile. It was best described by the cellar master of Remy Krug Champagne, who said, with a single vintage, God decides the quality, but with non-vintage, I become God. So in our case, Adam Hannett becomes God in terms of the quality of what goes into the Classic Laddie. This bottle is really indicative of the signature style of Bruichladdich. It's floral, elegant, crisp, sweet, really fruity, citrusy, and pear, very light and easy to drink. I am admittedly not a frequent whiskey drinker, or wasn't prior to getting acquainted with the Bruichladdich brands. The Classic Laddie changed that for me. It's really excellent in highball. It is really easy to drink. This is the best place to start if you're getting curious about Scotch. As we mentioned, it is unpeated. Baird's dries this malt with hot air for us. So we're bucking tradition in that sense. And it is made using 100% Scottish barley. Typically, in any blend for the Classic Laddie, it does contain a barrel or 2 of the Islay grown barley in every vatting, but we're mostly looking at barley from our partners on the mainland. The reason being, we do have barley explorations for all of our product lines where we can get a bottle of Bruichladdich that is 100% Islay barley. So we want you to be able to taste that difference, right? So we focus on the mainland barley. There's a little bit of that Islay barley in the blend just for nuance. But if you really want to taste that Islay barley, you'd be looking for the limited run Bruichladdich Islay barley bottles. They're clear. They look a little different. So, there's a long held belief that the older the whiskey, the better it must be, but that's not the case. You can have really old, tired whiskeys and young, bright, exuberant ones. And it's really important to remember that the younger whiskey just shows more of the character of the barley and the distillation, where an older whiskey is showing you more from the cask itself. Neither one is better. They're just different. And that's why we've decided to sort of make this blend. And with that, that goes into one quick note on no hidden measures. So we can go to the next slide. Going back to the concept of cuvee style or multi-vintage whiskey or non-age statement whiskey, such as Classic Laddie, it brings us back to one of my favorite elements of this brand. Bruichladdich has decided to share as much information as legally allowed as it relates to the cask composition in each and every batch of the Classic Laddie. There's actually a batch code on the back of every bottle. And upon entering the code into our website, you get taken to a page like the one you're seeing here, which gives you a full breakdown of the vatting that you have. You'll understand or see here that there's some stuff sort of blacked out. That is because we can't legally show you that information. If you want to have a better understanding of that, we'll talk about it in Portland. But it's all about understanding flavor and giving you as much information as we can. We want you to appreciate and understand the flavor that our house style is renowned for, and understand that it has this fruity and floral characteristic from the stills, but vanilla notes in the whiskey from the American oak. The European casks are contributing more spicy and nutty flavors, while the wine they once held offers additional layers of complexity to the fruity and floral notes that are already found in the spirit. So if you're curious to learn this, I'm going to plug a little thing right here, more about the cask components of Classic Laddie. This is the part where I do that self-promotion about the education session we're hosting at Portland Cocktail Week. So I won't give it all away. Suffice to say, this is the deep dive that we're looking at And we're diving in a way that we've never done before this year. It's a really exciting training. So as Brittany said, get your applications in if you haven't done that yet and come hang out with me. It's going to be really fun. Okay, so on to our next brand, which is Port Charlotte. Port Charlotte was actually the first whiskey distilled at Bruichladdich upon its reopening in 2001. And it's taken a journey into its final form that you see today, which is that heavily peated 40 parts per million, 10-year age single malt. Port Charlotte resembles more of that smoky peated style that people expect from an Islay single malt. However, they don't have that distinctive medicinal iodine flavor profile. Some people say it tastes like Band-Aids that you may expect or may have been put off from in the past. And why is that different? So Baird's currently uses peat that's local to them for the malting process in Aberdeenshire and Caithness region. The peat up there isn't as oily as in some parts of Scotland, and this has an impact on the flavor, giving more of like a wood smoke flavor instead of iodine. That region of peat has been shown to affect the flavor depending on the plant life in that area, right? So there's definitely some classes going on talking about all of the different peats and talking about phenols. Please go dig into those. I know they're available on distance learning. It's a super complex piece of understanding peated whiskeys. But the sphagum being present always has that high concentration of phenols. But as I mentioned, it's complicated. All the geographical locations are different. And it contributes to a unique fingerprint for each type of peat. So the choice of the peat that Baird's is using makes that really sweet and smoky flavor. I find that if you're like really into mezcal, Port Charlotte is a good place to go because it's more of that like meaty, sweet, smoky type of thing that you get in mezcals. So we can go on to the next one. As I mentioned, Port Charlotte 10, that's our flagship of the heavily peated range. So perfect introduction to peated whiskey fans who already get into that type of stuff, but want to try something a little different. It's 70% maturation in first and second fill ex-American whiskey casks. So it carries some subtle like vanilla fudgy notes. And then the other 25% is second fill French wine casks, which really complement those fruity notes. And with that well-balanced barbecue smoke, it welcomes both peat and non-peat fans to kind of step out of their comfort zone and try something new, right? So again, age statement, 10 years old. This one has it on the bottle, but believe it or not, it's assembled on Islay using a variety of vintages that may be a little older. You might be aware that to put an age on the bottle, it can only be the youngest whiskey in the bottle. So it is at its youngest 10-year age in every Port Charlotte 10-year, but there's some older stuff going on in there as well. Again, 100% Scottish barley and bottled at 50% ABV. And then finally, on to the ever elusive Octomore. Octomore is in a category of its own. There's really nothing else like it. It had never been done before. Sometimes they say there was no Octomore before Octomore, and it's kind of in a class of its own. It's known as the world's most heavily peated whiskey, but it's more than that. It's supposed to stand up to convention and challenge you to question what you know. It's limited experimental releases. They come out every fall. As I mentioned, our current release just came out this past week. And it kind of tempts you to explore the unexpected, right? So we call Octomore the impossible equation. And why is that? It is too heavily peated. The ppm is insane, right? It's too young. It's aged typically only 5 years. And it's bottled at cask strength. So it's too high proof. Those things shouldn't work. But somehow they come together and create a whiskey that's really more than the sum of its parts, right? And anyone who's had Octomore before, like if you like peated whiskeys, this is the one to get into. It's special. So we can go to the next slide and talk about Octomore Farm. As I mentioned, that is where our spring water comes from. It's a farm at the top of the Port Charlotte village, which once had a distillery of its own many years ago. Octomore Farm is now known for growing barley for us at Bruichladdich and also provides the fresh spring water that we use in our bottling hall for bringing our products down to the bottling strength at 50%. Octomore range seeks to sort of honor the history of Octomore Farm and its contributions to our whiskey. So that's where that name comes from. We're going to briefly talk about the Octomore ranges and give you an explanation. Each of the range of Octomores we release follows a numbering system. The first numbers refer to the number of the release, and then the decimal point tells you about the maturation and composition of the specific release. It's important to emphasize that regardless of the current series we're on in Octomore, they always follow this structure here, right? So the point ones are always going to be mainland barley, matured predominantly in American bourbon or whiskey casks. The point twos are always going to be 100% Scottish mainland barley with a focus on European cask influence, wine, cognac, etc. And the point threes are always going to be single estate releases. So single Octomore farm barley, single field, single vintage. We call it the Octomore of Octomore. It's distilled from 100% Islay grown barley and matured in a combination of American and European oak. Right now, you can go to the next slide. We are on our 13th release of Octomore. So distilled in 2016 from the 2015 harvest of 100% Scottish grown concerto barley. I'm talking about 13.1 because this is really like the core base starting point, right? Malted this year to 137.3 parts per million. So think about Port Charlotte being 40 ppm. I believe Ardbeg's like 50 ppm. So 3 times that. It's insane. Bottled at 59.2% and bottled unchill, filtered, and coloring free at the Bruichladdich Distillery. Full-term maturation in first fill American whiskey casks, 5 years on Islay. So this is going to be your starting point this year for Octomore if you see it out and you want to try something really wacky and fun. That'll be the one. And if you hit Scotch Lodge in Portland while you're in town, they will definitely have it there, as well as quite a few of the other Octomore releases from the past. All right. So that concludes the overview of our core range. I hope today you've taken away a few things: the history of Bruichladdich, sort of our handcrafted practice, and maybe a preliminary understanding of the whiskeys that we produce.
I know I learned a lot, and I can't tell you how impeccable your timing is.
1 hour, 1 minute. Look at that.
I know. And the lovely man who lives at the end of my street owns a landscaping company called Here We Mow Again, which is 100% the reason I hired them to cut our grass. And he just arrived. So I know Tango is my dog from yesterday that decided to pop in and say, hey, is definitely on a timer to freak out time. But we did have a question that came in, and I know that you answered this pretty well when you were talking about the peat that you use in your peated range, and specifically when you were talking about Port Charlotte and how it has a bit of a more like barbecue-y, sweeter kind of smoke than that like heavier medicinal side. But do you notice in the Octomore that some of those medicinal qualities come through from it being so heavily peated?
You know, I am a big fan of telling people that whatever their palate experiences is right. So if you pull those notes from it being so heavily peated, then yes. And that's okay. I don't like to tell people what they should taste. You know, everybody's palate is different. But I do think less that it brings out the medicinal kind of flavors and more that it's just very strong. It's very heavy on the nose. It's very sort of all encompassing across like all parts of your palate. I will say if you drink a dram of Octomore, it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to go back and drink an unpeated whiskey right after that and get much of a flavor from it. It is going to sort of dominate your palate. So I don't think that it brings out any of that medicinal quality. You still get that sort of sweet, smoky vibe. Just a lot of it.
And I personally had a question because I know you talked about the thousands of different kinds of barrels that you all have. And I saw on the infographic that you posted up the first time that you're like, if you scan this code, it'll tell you. I was like, oh, lots of wine barrels. Are there sherry barrels hiding out in there filled with delicious things as well?
Yes, there are a lot of sherry barrels. There's a little bit of everything. There's export, there's ex-sherry, there's I didn't really actually look and see any like vermouth barrels, but I bet they're in there somewhere. We are under NDA for like a lot of the barrels that we get. But yes, there is actually an independent like small sherry producer that we have a contract with that specifically sends barrels to us each year. It's very kind of all over the place and how many of them we get. But they do come to us specifically, and we use them both in the classic Laddie blend and in things like black art, which I didn't talk about because I didn't want to get too deep, or some of the European cask influence, Octomores, et cetera, as well as the cask explorations that we do for Port Charlotte. So we have some limited runs that'll come out that'll be specifically X sherry cask or X wine cask, et cetera, that are focused on that. And those are actually, for the peated range, some of my favorites. So if you see any cask exploration series, Port Charlotte, please try it. It's really amazing.
Well, I certainly can't wait to try it. And I feel like I've learned so much today. And I feel like we've gotten so many Easter eggs about what we're going to get to learn more all together in person in Portland. This is, it's giving me Midnight Mayhems with me like vibes. So I feel like we've got lots of clues, but there's only one way to really find out, and that's by getting your application into Portland Cocktail Week, pdxcw.com/apply, and then you could go hang out with Erin all day and learn a ton of stuff about Bruichladdich that we didn't even get to cover in this hour today. Erin, thank you so much for staying with me for 2 days to let us know all about the botanist and all about Bruichladdich, to get us ready for Portland Cocktail Week. And Madrina, can you pop up Erin's Instagram on the screen? Make sure you go follow Erin at Erin Rue on Instagram. I almost said on Portland Cocktail Week, but we don't have her own social media platform at this point in time. We'll keep you updated. But make sure you follow Erin on Instagram. So that way, if you have any follow-up questions, maybe you're going back and watching this later, you can reach out and get clarification, because Erin knows all of the things about the things. So do that. Also, if you enjoyed this class, make sure you smash that like or love button. I know it's love. You loved it. You had a great time. You can follow us here at facebook.com/PDXCW. Or you can go over to our YouTube page at youtube.com/PDXCW. And while you are there, just hit subscribe. That way you know when a class is coming on, and you can either watch it then or make a plan to go back and watch it later. And I feel like those are all of the talking points that I'm supposed to cover, which is to tell you to hang out with us more, because we like to have you around. So with that, Erin, thank you again. Everybody have a great Tuesday. And I will see you back here tomorrow, but I promise I'll give you some of your time alone on Thursday. I swear. So have a good day. We'll see you back here tomorrow. And Erin, we'll see you in Portland.
Yes. Thank you, guys. See y'all in Portland.
Bye.